You've watched the TikToks, the Instagram Reels, you've seen the post. Pop psychology is a big thing in this world. More people than ever are using this kind of therapeutic language, talking about toxic people and trauma and narcissism. Categories like that have spilled out into the public. But is this good? Is this the right way to view the world? And also, there's a whole other question here. Is the church supposed to respond to those kind of therapeutic crises? Well, today on the show, we have a very interesting episode with Dr. Matthew Loftus. Dr. Matthew Loftus is a physician and writer who practices family medicine at a mission hospital in Kenya. His work has appeared in publications such as the New York Times, The Atlantic, Christianity Today, First Things, and Mere Orthodoxy. He is the recipient of the Trinity Forum's 2025 Michael J. Gerson Prize for Excellence in Writing on Faith and Public Life, and has recently released the book, Resisting Therapy Culture: The Dangers of Pop Psychology and How the Church Can Respond. This is a great conversation today, but bear in mind we had some technical difficulties with him streaming in across the world from a completely different continent. I'm Jake Doberenz, and this is Christianity Without Compromise, a podcast for Christians who love Jesus but are tired of culture war faith. Now, let's get to rebuilding a faith that actually looks like Jesus. Matthew Loftus, it is great. Dr. Matthew Loftus, it is great to have you on Christianity Without Compromise today. I'm excited to talk about this subject.
It's great to be here, Jake. Thanks for having me on.
And all the way from Kenya, all the way from the other side of the world, that is even more of an honor that you would cross the time zones and the continents to talk about this subject that I am imagining people will have opinions about, okay? So
Yeah.
we won't spoil it right now, but I think people are going to have some opinions. People have opinions on this subject, so there you go.
It's an important subject, so I'm glad people are thinking about it.
I want to start with some background, with a story, as I often do on the show. So once upon a time, you were in an intensive group therapy session for addiction, and the group really pushed you to find some way that your parents messed you up. Can you take us back to that time and explain what you were feeling, what was going on there?
Yeah. Like you said, it was an intensive group therapy session for addiction. It was me and a couple of other guys, and there was a kind of a track that the leader wanted us to go through of thinking about what sort of messages we had received as children and young adults growing up in our families, what kinds of things we got, positive, negative, from our families. Overall it was very helpful. But at one point there were kind of like 3 different messages on the wall about, like, one of them being my needs or wants could not be appreciated. Another one I think was I have to perform to be loved. And I had to pick one. And it just felt wrong to me that I had to, in the schema of the group, I had to say there was something wrong that my parents did. And I think that they were careful about not being a matter of blame or anything like that. But it still felt like there was this story that had to be told that involved some deficiency from, mostly my parents. And then I had to kind of embrace that in order to move forward. And I think you could make the argument that, you were already in a group therapy session. So of course you were locked in some of these therapeutic ideals. But to me, that moment kind of captured a lot of what I feel like is wrong with therapy culture, and the ideas that you have to have this therapeutic understanding of yourself, this very Freudian, like, my childhood was messed up in some way, and that explains where I am today. Like, can I just have bad decisions? Like, can I have just made bad decisions on my own? Do I have to blame my parents for it?
Yeah, thanks for taking us back to that moment that kind of started everything for you, at least this journey. So you give us a little bit of a definition there. Talk to us a little bit more about therapy culture. You use this phrase, therapy culture, and how has that kind of entered into all different facets of societies? Give us some other examples, maybe, of how that has popped up.
Sure. Yeah. So therapy culture is um, the medicalization of normal human experiences. So taking something like our normal sadness, our normal feelings of anxiety, other experiences, situations, relationship conflicts, and putting this medicalized language, these diagnoses, specific therapeutic treatments. It's mostly about diagnoses and labels and things like that. So it's medicalizing these experiences that we all have. Then it's judging institutions by whether or not they conform to whatever therapeutic ideals are in vogue. And lastly, it's the way in which that process of assigning labels, putting everything through a therapeutic lens, like, is it, does this jive with what therapy thinks is good right now? And the way that takes away people's ability to choose for themselves, and it makes them passive, um, instead of having agency in their own decisions. And this is obviously something that's been going on for a long time. Philip Reeve wrote a book called Triumph of the Therapeutic in 1966. So it's, people have been talking about how therapy and psychology have uh, influenced our culture for a long time. But especially in the last 10 years, just seen this massive surge in people using the language and the ideas of therapy to describe many, many more aspects of human life. I think a great example, is trauma, right? That you have, trauma is happening everywhere. Lots of people are understanding, or being told to understand experiences as traumatic that might not have been understood, or that I would say would not have been understood as such 10, 20, 30 years ago. Um, there's these little bits here and there, right? Like narcissist, so many people are getting armchair diagnosed as narcissists. And if you've ever met someone who genuinely carries a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, like, it's night and day difference between someone who's just being selfish, or someone who doesn't care about the experiences of others, or is actively in a conflict within a relationship. So those are just two examples that come to mind right away as ways in which people are not only defining themselves and their experiences through this therapeutic lens, but it's also sort of a corruption of what that therapeutic language was meant for in the first place. And then that's starting to suck out as people, when people think of themselves as recipients of trauma or dealing with a narcissist, there's this certain amount of passivity of like, well, I can't deal with that. If it's a traumatic event, then I need to be avoiding anything like it in the future, or I need to be minimizing my exposure to anything like this. And so it kind of pulls people back from, I think, having agency in their own lives and making choices for themselves.
And I want to know if this is kind of what you're talking about too. I hear a lot about people using boundaries in kind of a
Mm,
maybe a more stretchy way, right?
mhm.
Everybody's toxic if when the person critiques you or says something you don't like or disagrees with you, they're toxic. Cut them out. We got to have boundaries, and that's
Yeah.
just always been like, man, like how are we supposed to love people that are different than us? How do we love our enemies? Or like what are we doing here?
Yeah.
How are we supposed to be Jesus to people if we just cut off every single person that disagrees with us? Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about? This medicalization of just kind of
Absolutely.
basic human behaviors.
Yeah. No, I think
Okay.
that that's another
Yeah.
great example and another idea of kind of what the experts will call concept creep, of the idea of
Mm,
boundaries
mm,
in relationships. I think is meant for some very specific situations, and it's important in those situations, right? If you are dealing with someone who really does have narcissistic personality disorder, or someone who um, repeatedly won't respect your feelings, or is making a lot of self-destructive choices in their life, um, then it's good to have boundaries with that person. People who tend to be people pleasers or whatever, the extreme, they need to know how to set healthy boundaries. But, when it comes to everything is about boundaries. And like you said, like any kind of friction or conflict in a relationship, all of a sudden now you got to set up the boundary. Or again, toxic is another. I mean, that one's not even that's a very therapeutic. It doesn't have a, a real defined meaning in any psychiatry textbook or anything like that. And it's just sort of a pejorative that gets thrown around when you're just trying to paint someone in a way that is unflattering in therapy culture, without really being specific.
yeah. Okay. Thank you for helping me with that. That's what I was kind of thinking you were getting in that. That was the
Mhm.
thought that was the example that popped up to my mind because
Yeah, no, I think that that's a
I
great
see my
example.
peers do that. I'm a
Hmm.
relatively young lad, and yeah, it's a lot of the people around me are
Hmm.
approaching life in that way.
Yeah, I was just going to say that putting up extra unnecessary boundaries also like deprives people of the opportunity to grow, and learn to deal with conflict in a healthy way, to be pushed, right? If you have all these boundaries all the way, then you're never forced to extend yourself in a way that helps you to grow, right? That was just the only thing I wanted to add there.
Well, that's a good segue into what I wanted to ask is like, what is the issue here of, this medicalization of normal emotions and experiences? How does that end up like hurting people? Why are you writing a book about this?
Yeah. Well, I wrote the book because, yeah, I do see it hurting people, and I think that really the nub of the problem is that when we medicalize these normal experiences, then that abstracts these experiences from us, and it makes us into passive recipients of therapeutic interventions rather than agents who are capable of making our own choices, helping others, pushing ourselves beyond, what we are normally capable of doing. And there's a lot of good research, for example, suggesting that if you are constantly screening people for mental illness right now. This is a big thing in schools that is being pushed in certain states where they have these screening programs. And turns out if you constantly ask teenagers, do you feel sad? Do you feel anxious? Do you ever think about killing yourself? Blah, blah, blah. The more that you ask them, the more that they will start to understand the normal ups and downs of teenage life as now this diagnosis. So now I have, once I incorporate that idea in my mind, then now I have depression. Now there's this thing that I have, and it's as real as pneumonia or anemia, right? And that self-understanding then starts to reflect the way I behave. And obviously there's a lot of different cues for how people with depression look like, are supposed to behave. People tend to dwell more on their problems rather than thinking about what are solutions or how can I grow past this. And that cycle of feeling something, assigning a label to that's medicalized, and then feeling more of those things as I think as a person thinks about and self understands or understands themselves as a person with depression, with this diagnosis, with this illness, that can really spiral out of control, especially when you start introducing medications to the mix that, have side effects, have effects. I mean, your best case scenario is someone gets a drug that they don't need and it's just like a waste of money or whatever. But at worst, you get side effects from the medication. You start taking other medications to counter those side effects, and people end up feeling sicker and being sicker, and become more and more passive and less capable of doing things for themselves and living a healthy and engaged life.
I briefly taught middle school for a while, and I saw some of what you're talking about, both in terms of diagnosing kids, but also this strange, like, pendulum swing from an era of our nation, of our culture, where you wouldn't talk about mental illness, to now the other
Mm-hmm.
side, where it's like a sense of pride in in your mental illness or whatever,
Yeah.
and that would come out as an excuse when these kids would want to do something. I have anxiety. That's my autism showing up. Blah, blah, blah. And I
Mm-hmm.
always want to accommodate kids where there is a need for accommodation.
Sure.
But
Absolutely.
wow, that was really interesting to see that level of, yep, that's my depression. What are you gonna do?
Mm,
And
wow.
that's not good for sure.
Yeah, no, definitely not. And yeah, no, that's I mean, that's exactly why I wrote the book, is because these things are showing up more and more in a lot of different and unhealthy ways. Yeah, what you described is exactly the problem. And of course, that just metastasizes. The older people get, the more diagnoses they accrue. There is this sense in which, like you said, there used to be a lot of stigma about talking about mental health or having a mental illness. And nowadays, I don't think, I wouldn't say this is across the entire Western culture or whatever, but certainly among young people and among young people who are very actively engaged online and whatnot, a diagnosis is really like a, almost a fashion statement. It's an identity. It's
Interesting,
makes
yeah.
some people more, gives them more status within their little clique or whatever, and that is really poisonous. I think to not only to those people but also to other relationships that they have, and I think what ends up getting lost, and we'll probably come back to this later in the interview, but people who actually have those diagnoses, who are really suffering under the weight of a severe mental illness, now their diagnosis is thought of as this trendy identity, right? And they're like, this is actually this really miserable thing to live with that I'm struggling with, and here are these other people that have uh, taken this on for themselves and are making this my life and my pain into a fashion statement.
Maybe before we get too many angry comments or something like that, can you talk about the good things about therapy? We'll move to the church in a little bit, but
Mm-hmm.
tell me, like, what is therapy at its best? What is this therapeutic language at its best? What's it supposed to be doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, obviously, one of the reasons why therapy culture has taken over is that therapy is actually very good at a lot of things. And certainly again, going back over 100 years to the pioneers of psychology, Freud and whatnot, the Maslow, the self-understanding is a really important part of our lives. And the language and ideas of psychology and therapy are really powerful. Certainly for, again, going back to the very first example, the idea that something in your childhood could affect the way you behave as an adult was a pretty revolutionary idea when it first came around. So that's, I think, where I think from the cultural standpoint, that's sort of the nub of usefulness that kind of got therapy in the door. Yeah. So for people who have these diagnoses, who are either not functional because of mental illness, or they are getting through each day, but they're living with immense suffering, therapy can be really powerful in helping people to understand what's happening inside themselves, and then reconfigure the way that they're thinking or acting or understanding what's happening to them in a way that makes them feel better, and activates their agency, so that way they are able to make good choices for themselves and enjoy their lives more and have a healthier perspective on their own life. And then for certainly, and this is kind of where therapy and counseling kind of are on a spectrum of where there's a lot of overlap, but certainly for some people have a very specific problem in their life, and therapy can be very helpful, or counseling can be very helpful in figuring out that one specific problem, whether it's in their marriage or it's an addiction or it's something else like that, where it's a common problem, and there's a well established set of therapeutic solutions that help people to think differently about their life and change things.
So I kind of feel bad. We haven't like talked too much, Christian or biblical perspectives and things. But
Mm-hmm.
one of the points of your book is also to say, hey, therapy does this well and church does this well.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the church's role in mental health and in this kind of culture that you talk about? What does the church do best?
Good question. Well, church does not do therapy best, in the sense that if a pastor is trying to contort themselves to be good in the eyes of therapy culture, to be ideal, and be whatever therapy culture wants the church to be, then that's going to be really disappointing. You can go to a therapist to get therapy. If you go to church expecting your pastor to do for you what therapy does for you, that's going to be an unrealistic set of expectations on the pastor. And any pastor who tries to do that through the work of the church is going to be a disappointment to people who go to the church, because that's not what church is for, right? The church does not exist to solve people's problems. The church exists to worship Jesus Christ. So a lot of people have their problem solved just by going to church and worshiping Jesus, fellowshipping with other Christians, receiving the sacraments, hearing the word of God, right? These are all very powerful things. And there's certainly a reason why the Bible very often uses the imagery of healing, right? Because there is a sense in which we are healed by God's grace acting in our life. But it's when and this is I think a broader problem beyond therapy culture. A lot of people expect the church to be this problem fixing machine. And while there are many commands in the Bible that I think Christians should live out as part of their life together, go and fix problems in the world, right? There's a lot of problems. There's people that need to be fed. There's justice that needs to be advocated for. There's art to be made and lonely people to be loved and cared for, right? Like those aren't the primary thing, right? That anything like any problem fixing that happens out of any individual church is going to happen when that church is focusing on the things that only the church can do. Only the church can give people the sacraments, can baptize people and give them the Lord's Supper. The church exists to worship God, right? That we are commanded to come together, to hear the word preached, to sing together, to worship together, to fellowship together, and it's in that context of that very, I would say, narrow mandate that then anything else can kind of grow out of that that really solid foundation. So it's obviously tough, right? Because and in the book I try very hard to distinguish between the big C church, like the church universal, right? That's all of us Christians. We all, like, there's so many responsibilities and expectations that apply to the church universal that I would never put on any one individual church. And I think any one individual church, has got to be focused on the one thing. And even, again, like if you've got those basics down and your church wants to start a ministry, like a mental health ministry, like go at, like that can be a really powerful thing. Maybe that's the thing that God wants your little church to be doing. But I think nowadays with therapy culture, people are getting it backwards, and they are expecting the church to be a vehicle for fixing their mental health problems. And it is not that. And if you go to church expecting that, you will be disappointed and probably angry.
Yeah, thank you for talking us through that. That might end up being one of the more challenging parts of this episode for some people, but I'm in agreement that we have put too much on the church to solve all the problems, to do all the things.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do that, it loses what actually makes it distinct, that actual identity of the church. So I appreciate you talking about what the church is supposed to do: the sacraments, baptism, singing, those kind of things, worshiping God. Absolutely. But yeah, there's room for those kind of ministries. There's room for that. I used to attend a church that I believe somebody passed away, and in their will they left like a fund so that anybody in the church that needed counseling, the church would pay for it. It wasn't
great.
Church counseling, it wasn't from the pastor.
Yeah.
But they would invest in that, people that really needed it. And I think that's a cool ministry that we could think about doing. But lots of good stuff that we can wrestle with and chew on here today. I want to end, man, I rewrote this question like 25 times, it seems, because what it seems to me at the core of some of this therapy culture is people wanting to avoid all aspects of suffering, or people wanting to not be responsible for whatever, they offload the responsibility to somebody else or something like that. It seems like that's right. That's the core of a lot of things there.
Absolutely.
And your the author of your foreword, Dr. Alan Noble, was on our show back in March.
That was a great episode.
And he talked about this virtue of fortitude. And I want you to kind of leave us here with sort of your encouragement for people that maybe want to move the blame, or maybe don't like this suffering here. What is the Christian, the biblical vision here of things like suffering that pop psychology just doesn't understand?
Yeah, great question. I think therapy culture tends to send people in one of two directions, and people could sort of alternate during any given day. One is wallowing in suffering and thinking about, again, like I said, like if you can, if you identify the anything bad that happens in your life as a trauma, and there are people that are explicitly saying, well, we should think of everything as a micro trauma. I'm like, whoa, medicalization. And then on the other hand, always trying to avoid like self-medicating suffering, whether that's through scrolling or eating or shopping or other kinds of self-care. I think there's a vision of self-care that is being sold to us that is very much about being self-centered and avoiding suffering and avoiding anything that pushes you beyond your comfort zone. And then there's a vision of self-care that, as Joy Clarkson says, is recognizing the limits of yourself, right? That recognizing that you as a person have been created by God to work and rest. And so when we push ourselves too hard or avoid any kind, stay in permanent rest mode or whatever, then we really miss out on, I think, what Alan is talking about with fortitude, which is experiencing things that are difficult, that are sometimes painful, and growing through them, right? That when we encounter things that are really difficult, that is God's way of strengthening us and teaching us to rely on him. Suffering is always an invitation from God. There are a lot of different ways to think about suffering. Maybe it's a test, maybe or a trial. Maybe it's Satan attacking you. Maybe it's the consequence of your own sin. Maybe it's just unexplained, like Job, something happening terrible. But it is always an invitation from God to reach out to him and rely on him and call to him and know that God has experienced suffering on our behalf and has chosen to suffer with us in Christ on the cross. And through that process of suffering, feeling something or experiencing something terrible, being knocked down by it, and then getting back up again, reaching out for God's hand, that's a process of growth as human beings. And that's part of how God mysteriously has worked it out, that we would draw closer to him. So then just to clarify, this is not like, well, everything happens for a reason. God, you have to figure out what the reason is that God gave you the suffering. No, like some things are just unexplainable. Okay. Some things are horrible. Mm-hmm. Like God could have chosen to do it a different way. And that would have been fine. Didn't need to be that bad. And yet it's still always an invitation to draw near to God and experience his goodness.
Well, Matthew, thank you for walking us through this. Let's talk about, well, first of all, your book and anything else you want to plug or point people to. I mean, you've written widely. Just tell us all the things now as we're beginning to wrap up, although we still have one more question. What do you want to tell people? Yeah.
Yeah, so you can buy the book. It's called Resisting Therapy Culture, The Dangers of Pop Psychology and How the Church Can Respond. And, it does what it says in the title. And it explores pretty much everything that we talked about here today in much more detail, and especially with a focus on, okay, so what are some of these hot button issue. What does the science actually say about things like trauma and addiction and whatnot? So there's also my family website, www.matthewandmaggie.org. So it just talks about what we do here in Kenya and our family ministry. You can sign up for our email newsletters. And then within that website, there's links to writing on a lot of different subjects. I love, of course, talking about health and medicine, politics, culture, video games, all those kinds of things. And then, you can find me on Twitter, the website formerly known as Twitter, at Matthew_Loftus.
Great. Well, I got one final question for you that everybody gets asked on the show, and this is how we'll wrap up today. So I'm going to read it just as it is written for everybody. Here we go. As we close, leave the audience with just one practical action they can do this week to live out their faith fully for Jesus.
Call a friend. Someone that you haven't talked to in a while, someone that you're thinking about, someone that God has put on your heart, someone that you know is struggling with something, or just that you haven't connected in a while, but you appreciate their friendship. Having that time of connection and talking and sharing about life, even if it might be a little awkward at first, I think is really valuable, and something that anyone can do.
Great. Love that so much. Well, thank you everybody for listening today. Dr. Matthew Loftus, thank you so much for being on, talking about your book. Excited for that and all of that. The only last thing I'm going to do is recommend that you guys share this episode with people. Share this episode with somebody that maybe you hear uses too many of those therapy buzzwords and maybe doesn't understand what they mean. Or share this with somebody that that needs some help. I mean, this is not a substitute for therapy, this podcast, by the way, but we can start the conversation and point people into what therapy does and counseling and what the church does well. So again, Matthew, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you so much for having me, Jake. I really appreciate it.
This episode of Christianity Without Compromise was hosted by me, Jake Doberenz, and produced by Theophany Media, my podcast production company. If this conversation served you, please rate and review the show and share it with a friend and help others find it. You can also subscribe at jakedoberenz.substack.com to get email updates with new episodes every Tuesday and my often humorous theological reflections on Fridays. And as always, don't just listen, live it. Live out that Christianity without compromise. Thanks for listening.